Hi, it's Mark Bossert, producer of the Pawlik Automotive podcast. And of course, we're here with Mr. Bernie Pawlik, Pawlik Automotive in Vancouver, servicing and repairing cars for 38 years in Vancouver, 19-time winners of Best Auto Repair in Vancouver as voted by their customers. And of course, we're talking cars. How are you this morning, Bernie?
I'm doing pretty well.
So, we're speaking about a Chevrolet Uplander. This is a little bit of a rare model, I guess. Minivan. What was happening with it?
Yeah, well, they're not entirely rare. I mean, this was actually the Chevy's replacement for the Venture van, but I think Ventures were horrible vans. They were like one of the worst products GM's put out in a long time, and we can talk about those in another situation. But the Uplander is definitely a huge improvement. But yeah, I don't think they sold tons of them. I don't have the specs, but you certainly don't see as many as you did with the Ventures. So this van basically had a really bouncy ride to the vehicle. It's a regular customer. We've serviced this vehicle for many years, and I do a service of picking this vehicle up at the person's house or their business. So I tend to drive it a little more often. I can notice right away the ride of the front of the vehicle is very bouncy. It just didn't feel quite right.
You had to replace the struts. Is that what was going on?
Yeah, exactly. So the front struts were worn out, and basically, so I was saying the ride was bouncy. People often wonder, oh, how do I know if my struts or shocks are worn? And by the way, a strut has a shock absorber in it, and that's the primary wear component is the actual shock absorber. How you can tell? I mean, you can just feel it in the vehicle when you come to, especially if you come to a stoplight. The vehicle should, you push the vehicle, you hit the brake, you come to a stoplight. The front end of the vehicle dips and it bounces up once and stops. And if it bounces even a slight bit more, you can tell your struts are worn out. But you can also just get a general feel that the vehicle just doesn't feel like it's really gripping. I wouldn't say gripping the road, but it feels like it's a little out of control. So that's we've been fixing cars for a long time, so I have a feel right away. But if you have a vehicle that feels like that might be an indication your struts or shocks are worn. That extra bounciness is certainly quite noticeable.
So I'm sure there's probably a recommended interval to change struts. What is that?
Well, there used to be a recommended interval, and there was a lot of, and this came from strut and shock manufacturers. Replace your shocks every 80,000 kilometers or 50,000 miles. And over the years of working on cars, I've always thought that just seems ridiculous. Like I've had vehicles where the shocks and struts have gone way longer than that for years and years and years. Now, of course, because I'm sure they've got a lot of pushback and negative comments about that. The recommendation for the last few years is check your struts at 80,000 miles. Have them inspected. So, which is a much fairer idea. But really, as I said, you can tell most of the time right away by driving the car. There's also the bounce test you can do, which is you basically bounce the vehicle up and down a few times. Difficult to do on an F-350, by the way, but on a one-ton truck, I say not difficult, impossible. But on an average car, even a minivan, you can bounce the vehicle up and down, and if the vehicle will bounce up after you let your hand off the vehicle, and it'll drop down to a certain point. If it does any more bouncing, then the shocks or struts are worn. So that's a good test. But anyways, as far as the interval, I really believe you just need to drive the vehicle and see how it goes. This particular van, it's a 2006, so that makes it 12 to 13 years old at this point, and 12 to 13 years old, and it's got about 150,000 kilometers, I believe. So quite a lot over the 80,000 that was recommended. The thing about shocks and struts too, they're not like if you don't do them, you're going to create a lot of extra damage. I mean, sometimes your tires can wear funny, and sometimes you can actually have shock or strut wear and not even be aware of it. And you all of a sudden you'll have your tires worn funny. There's some interesting issues that happen. We can talk about that another time, but that's fairly rare, not entirely common. So, replacing them at a certain set interval, like a maintenance item, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think you're better to keep your money in your pocket and wait until the time when the wear is actually more applicable. I mean, sorry?
What's involved in replacing the struts on this van?
So this vehicle, there's a couple of different ways to do it, but let's just get into some pictures while we're at it. So there's the van. It's an 06 Uplander, and that is the strut that we replaced. So There's a couple ways you can do it. What's pretty common nowadays is what's called a quick strut. That's Monroe's brand name. There's other brands around that do the same thing, but essentially what it is, it's a complete assembly. As I said, the main wear part when a strut wears out is the actual shock absorber portion, which is sort of inside this tube, in the middle of the tube. This coily piece here is basically a dust protector. And if you remove it, you'll see a nice shiny shaft, and this is what moves up and down. You can see the spring, and then at the top too, the spring seat and strut mount bearing. That's also another part that tends to wear fairly frequently too, causing on some cars creaks and clunks and noises and things. So the nice thing about a quick strut, again using that brand name, is you replace this whole thing. There's nothing left over to wear out, and it's a little less labor intensive. You unbolt it from the vehicle, you bolt the new one in, and away you go. Whereas if you were just to replace the strut and maybe the bearing plate, we have all the tools to do it. You need to disassemble it because the spring is under a lot of pressure, and then change the parts over and then put it back together. So that's kind of the way it goes. I mean, in the olden days too, a lot of struts, you could actually change the cartridge, the piece right inside, so you'd actually keep the tube. That's really old fashioned nowadays. So that's gone back at least two or three decades now for that technology. This is what we did on this vehicle.
So when you've replaced the struts like that, is a wheel alignment necessary?
It is. On the rear, not necessary, not usually necessary. Sometimes it is, but on the front, absolutely, because it does affect the steering geometry. The McPherson strut is one part of the steering geometry. It's kind of like the upper control arm and spring and everything built into one. So kind of a neat feature, neat design in terms of minimizing the amount of components in a front suspension. But yeah, it's critical to do in alignment.
And how reliable are Chevy Uplanders?
Well, as we talked earlier, I was talking about Ventures. I mean, they're not bad. We've serviced this vehicle for quite a few years. This is a really good maintenance customer. We've had others that we've serviced. They're actually quite a reliable vehicle. GM did a good service compared to the Venture. We could do a whole podcast about all the things that went wrong on those vehicles, but we don't seem to see them as much on Uplander. So to me, this is a pretty decent minivan. Of course, getting old now. They haven't made them in a while.
So there you go. If you have a Chevy that you need some maintenance on, the guys to see in Vancouver are Pawlik Automotive. You can reach them at 604-327-7112 to book your appointment, or check out the website, pawlikautomotive.com. Hundreds of videos and articles about all kinds of makes, models, repairs, maintenance items. As well, there's hundreds of videos on our YouTube channel, Pawlik Auto Repair. And of course, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. And thank you, Bernie.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for watching. We totally appreciate it.